If you grew up thinking Sony basically invented consumer electronics, here's a fact that might surprise you. In the golden age of Japanese home stereo, when three other companies were fighting a brutal war for your living room, Sony was barely at the table. Not because it couldn't compete, because it looked at that war and decided not to fight it at all. This is the story of the audio battle Sony chose to skip in the very different, very expensive game it played instead. Through the 1960s and 70s, Japan's home audio market had a clear battlefield. The receiver, an amplifier and tuner built into one box, sold at prices a growing middle class could actually afford. Three companies fought hardest for that battlefield: Trio, later Kenwood, for tuners, Pioneer for speakers, and Sansui, which leaned hard into amplifiers and threw real marketing muscle behind it, including campaigns fronted by a famous Japanese movie star to build a young, enthusiastic fan base. Together, they were known as the Big Three, and the receiver market was where the volume, the price wars, and the brand loyalty all lived. Trio's roots went back to 1946, when it started as a small radio parts workshop. By the mid-1960s, it had built Japan's first fully solid-state amplifier, and by the late 1970s, its flagship Kenwood-branded Supreme series competed on raw power and dual power supplies. Pioneer's speaker business dated back to 1938, and by 1972, its SX717 receiver was already delivering 35 watts per channel to a mainstream audience. Sansui, founded in 1947, had spent 2 decades building its own amplifier reputation, from the tube-driven AU-111 in 1965 to the solid-state AU-777 in 1967. By the mid-1970s, all three were shipping loud, heavy, brightly lit receivers into showrooms across Japan and overseas, and the competition was fierce enough that a few watts per channel could genuinely swing a sale.
So where was Sony in all of this? Not where you'd expect. At the time, Sony was already a giant, but as the top maker of transistor radios. In the specific world of home audio receivers, the category the Big Three were fighting over, Sony was seen as little more than a tape recorder specialist. It simply wasn't a serious player in the market that defined mainstream Japanese hi-fi. That reputation went back decades. In September 1955, Sony had released the TR-55, Japan's first commercially produced transistor radio. Built around transistors the company designed and manufactured in-house rather than bought from an outside supplier. That launch made Sony's name in mass-market consumer electronics years before the home stereo boom even began. Sony's tape recorder business went back even further, to 1950, when the company, then still known as Tatsuko, built Japan's first tape recorder, the G-Type, marketed under the name tape recorder, with a lighter home use model following the next year. It was real brand strength, just built in a completely different product category than the one Trio, Pioneer, and Sansui were fighting over. And that wasn't an accident or a failure. It was a choice Sony had already made.
Japanese audio archive sites that catalog these old products in detail tell you exactly what Sony was doing instead. In 1965, Sony launched its ES series, standing for Extremely High Standard, and the very first model, the TA1120 integrated amplifier, was priced at 88,000 yen, a price point far above what a mainstream receiver buyer would ever pay. That wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate decision to skip the mass receiver market entirely and instead compete in high-end, standalone component audio, a smaller, pickier, much more expensive segment. Sony doubled down on that same strategy again in 1978, launching an even more extreme luxury line called Esprit. It didn't work commercially. The prices were so high that Esprit never sold in real volume, and the brand was eventually dissolved and folded back into Sony's regular R series. But the strategic direction never really changed. Sony's answer to the Big Three's price war wasn't to join it. It was to build products so expensive that the war didn't apply to them.
Line these two strategies up side by side, and you get a much clearer picture of what was actually happening in Japanese audio. The Big Three built their empire on receivers, accessible price, huge volume, mass market brand loyalty. Sony built a parallel, much smaller business on standalone components at prices that put it almost entirely out of reach of that same mass market. The scale of that gap is worth putting in real numbers. By the late 1970s, the Big Three's flagship receivers were built to sell in volume, at prices an aspiring middle-class household could stretch to afford. Sony parallel line ran in the opposite direction. The TA1120 at 88,000 yen in 1965, and by 1979, an Esprit-branded loudspeaker called the APM8, priced at roughly 1 million yen a pair, using a driver design Sony called Accurate Pistonic Motion. One category was built to be bought by as many people as possible. The other was built to be bought by almost no one. These weren't two companies competing in the same race. They were running two different races on the same track. And for years, that meant nobody could really call it a rivalry. Sony wasn't losing the receiver war, it had simply opted out of it.
To understand just how real the Big Three's mass market war was, look at two specific Sansui receivers that viewers actually asked me about after the last episode on Sansui. Sansui itself had been building toward that peak for decades. Founded in 1947 by Kosaku Kikuchi, originally as a transformer maker, the company introduced its first stereo tube amplifiers in 1958, its landmark AU111 tube integrated amplifier in 1965, and its first solid-state integrated amplifier, the AU777, in 1967. The first of the two viewer-requested models is the Sansui 9090DB, released in 1976, widely remembered as one of the flagship symbols of the Big Three's golden era, a receiver built right at the peak of that mass-market fight. The second is the Sansui G2200 and its sibling the G3300, large receivers built mainly for export around 1978 to 1980, priced at roughly $1,900. But by the time they hit the market, the ground was already shifting. The 1973 oil shock had already cut Japan's crude oil supply by roughly 30% almost overnight, tipping the country into recession, and forcing consumer electronics makers of every kind to rethink pricing just a few years before the G2200 and G3300 arrived. Layer on top of that a broader move towards separate components instead of all-in-one receivers, and buyer habits were shifting further still. By most accounts, these big receivers didn't sell as well as hoped. It's a small, concrete example of exactly the kind of market Sony had chosen to stay out of, one where timing, price, and volume could turn a flagship product into a disappointment almost overnight.
It's easy to look back and conclude that Sony was simply weak in home audio during this era, especially next to three companies fighting so visibly for the same customers. But that reading misses what was actually going on. Sony wasn't losing a fight. It had decided the fight itself wasn't worth having. Betting on a tiny, ultra-premium segment instead of the mass receiver market was a real strategic choice, and for a long stretch, it wasn't obviously the wrong one. There's a useful data point for judging which bet actually held up. In October 1982, Sony released the CDP-101, the world's first commercially available compact disc player, beating its own development partner Philips to market by several months. A year later, Sony gave the new format its own ES-branded flagship, the CDP-701 ES, which became a best-selling high-end CD player in Japan through 1983 and 1984. That's not the record of a company that had been sitting out of audio entirely. It's the record of a company whose 2 decades of investment in premium, standalone component engineering positioned it to lead exactly the kind of format transition the compact disc turned out to be. The Big Three's dominance in receivers was real. So was Sony's decision that receivers weren't the game it wanted to play.
Here's the twist, though. The mass receiver market the Big Three built their identity on eventually shrank, hit by the same digital shift and changing listening habits that reshaped audio everywhere. Betting everything on that one battlefield turned out to be a much riskier long game than it looked at the time. Trio, by then renamed Kenwood, merged with JVC in 2008 to survive as part of a larger holding company. Pioneer sold its home audio and AV business to Onkyo in 2014 and shifted almost entirely to car electronics. And Sansui itself filed for court-supervised restructuring in 2012, was delisted from the Tokyo Stock Exchange that same year, and the company that built the 9090DB was gone by 2014.
Sony's expensive, low-volume, high-end path never dominated headlines the way the Big Three's price wars did, but it also never depended on that shrinking mass market for its identity. Two very different bets, made at the same time, in the same country, in the same industry.
So the next time someone tells you Sony just wasn't a real audio company in the 70s, you'll know the fuller story. Sony wasn't absent from the war. It looked at the war being fought over price and volume, and chose to fight a completely different one, over price and prestige instead. Being third or fourth in one market doesn't mean much if you were never trying to win that market at all. That ES badge Sony first put on the TA1120 back in 1965 didn't disappear with the receiver wars. It reappeared on the CDP-701 ES in the CD era, and the same idea, paying a premium to sit at the very top of the line, outlived the mass market receiver war it was built to avoid by decades. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.